Firstly, a very warm welcome from Oxford Brookes University to our 125 years of nursing education year-long series of celebrations. This evening is our launch of our year's worth of events, and we have a website which is nursing.brookes.ac.uk/125 years, and you're very welcome to go to that website to find out all the events that we've got on. For those of you on Twitter, we also have a hashtag 125 years nursing Oxford. The events that we've got over this year are a lecture series of international speakers, both in Oxford and at our campus in Swindon. And we're absolutely delighted that Health Education England, Thames Valley, have sponsored the lecture series for us. So we're very grateful for that and thank them very much for their support. We've got a walk, fun run, on the 23rd of April at Harcourt Hill and at Swindon. I'll be doing the walking, but if any of you would like to do any running, you're most welcome. And details of all of that are on our website too. On the 21st of May, we've got a celebration lunch, which is open to absolutely everybody who would like to have a ticket. It's in the prestigious Brookes restaurant, and again, details of that will be on our website. On the 16th of October, we're very privileged that the annual St Fried's-wide Civic Cathedral service will be in honour of nursing this year, and that's a great privilege for us and brings together all of the community of Oxford and Oxfordshire to celebrate the wonder that is nursing. And concurrently with that, over a 2-week period, we're going to have an exhibition in Oxford Town Hall about the history of nursing and nursing education. So we hope that you'll be able to get along to that as well. Over the 18 months that we've been planning these events, we've designed a celebration booklet, and that details the last 13 decades of nursing in Oxford and also in Swindon. And we're delighted with our links, particularly in Swindon, as a scheme that was set up for Great Western Railways, in fact, was the forerunner of the NHS. And so it gives us a fantastic link between Oxford and Swindon for that. And we also have celebration mugs for sale as well. After our prestigious lecture that we've got in a few minutes, we'd be delighted if all of you would like to join us for coffee and tea, and also a piece of the celebration 125-year cake that is being cut at this very moment. And that's just out of the lecture theatre and down the stairs, and we'll show you all how to get there. But we'd be delighted if you'd like to join us. And also, we have a tree that's been designed by one of our fine arts students, Tess Russell-Pearce. And we have leaves that we would be very grateful for people to write on what nursing means to them and then attach them to the tree. And we'll be using this tree throughout the whole year of our celebrations. So by the end of the year, we'll have a wonderful montage of what nursing means to everybody who's attended. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Professor June Girvin, who's going to introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you very much.
Welcome oh, am I in the right place? Probably, yes. Can you hear me okay? Is that fine? Thank you. Welcome everyone to Oxford Brookes University, and welcome especially to this first lecture in a series of lectures as part of our celebrations of 125 years of nurse education in Oxford, as Liz has already talked about. These are exciting times for the faculty as we see our ambitious academic development plans begin to bear fruit. Just before this lecture, we launched the Oxford Institute of Nursing and Allied Health Research, OXINAR for short, the culmination of many actions leading us to this point. The sustainable carving out of resources, the allocation of space in a highly space pressurised environment, but most of all, the recruitment in the broadest sense of the word, of ambitious and renowned academic and clinical partners who share our vision for leading a centre of nursing and allied health research in Oxford, a centre that will be nationally and internationally renowned as it grows and strengthens. This is a very proud day for me. This institute has long been a dream of mine, and I'm thrilled to be at this springboard moment for the next stage of healthcare research development at Oxford Brookes. It's now my very great pleasure to introduce the first speaker in our celebratory series of lectures, Professor Brendan McCormack. Brendan is an accomplished academic, currently Professor of Nursing at Queen Margaret University, Edinburgh. He's a registered nurse and a registered mental health nurse with a BSc Honours degree. He was awarded a DPhil from our colleague university in Oxford in 1998. His research and teaching is focused around person-centred practice, gerontological nursing, practice development, and the implementation of research into practice. He has a particular interest in the use of the arts and creativity in healthcare research and development. He has published widely and prolifically in these areas and is on a number of specialist journal editorial boards and is editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Applied Gerontology. Brendan and I go back quite a long way to the days of the RCN Institute of Nursing, when it was based here in Oxford in the early 1990s. Brendan working on practice development here in Oxford, and I was doing the same in Swindon and in South Wales. We were both a part of the early development of quality assurance processes and models for nursing, and often ran workshops together nationwide for the Institute. They were good times, and I think simpler times then, but one thing's for sure, we always had plenty to talk about and plenty to laugh about. And so it's with real personal pleasure, as well as professional respect, that I leave you in the very capable hands of Professor Brendan McCormack for the next 45 minutes or so.
Good evening. This is a scary moment. It's an honour and a pleasure to be here doing this first of the series of lectures for the 125 years of nursing. I was saying to Angie, my friend and colleague, that looking around the room and being here is a bit like all of my memories coming flooding past, with faces that I clearly know and faces that I recognise and can't quite put names to, and just a whole series of memories being back here. It's an amazing time. 125 years is quite fantastic. And my daughter recently moved to live with us in Edinburgh, and we haven't lived together for 12 years, which probably says something in itself. And after 10 days, I know why that's happening. But I said to her, and she was born in John Radcliffe, so this is very much her heart is still in Oxford. And I said to her I was coming back, and she always gets excited. And I said what I was doing, and it's 125 years of nursing in Oxford, and she said, you have been at it that long, haven't you? So it kind of does feel like that, but it also feels very exciting, and still as exciting as it was then. So to be back in Oxford to kick off this series of lectures is very scary, but actually a real honour and a real privilege. And I'm really grateful to Deborah, to Liz and to June for asking me to do that, because I'm not quite sure why, but here I am. So, I thought I would speak about capturing the energy within the future landscape of nurse education. And I always like to give myself a bit of a challenge, nothing like talking about nursing education at a time when it's probably under its greatest threat and greatest challenge, but also the greatest opportunities. So it's kind of ahead of the time when I gave the title, and then as I was trying to prepare it, thinking, why did I do this again? So I'm hoping that actually it hopefully will make some sense. If you think I'm just going to stand here, it's because I have to stand here because it's being streamed, so my strutting is seriously limited to this bit of space. So you can't see me stride across the stage at any time, which I've been known to do at various points in my life. those of you who have been out drinking with me. So, I also want to acknowledge some of my own past in Oxford. And I came to Oxford in 1991, really to be mentored by two of the greatest women who have ever had an influence on my life, and that is Sue Pembury and Ruth Champion, who, of course, in many ways, just got nursing going here. And I owe so much to those two women who saw something in me back then that I certainly didn't see in myself, and who really coached me and mentored me in the rest of my academic career. Oxford was the place where I really found out about practice development and what practice development really was, and worked with some of the most amazing people here in Oxford, some of the biggest names in practice development and research, and who have since gone on to really change amazing things to do with nursing. And it was like working in a living laboratory. It was constantly changing, constantly developing, with some fantastic people who were absolutely committed and passionate about what nursing was about. And those years here in Oxford in the early 90s, mid to mid 90s, were really quite phenomenal. And I chose to use this special issue of the International Practice Development Journal to represent that, because from where it had moved to where some of that work is now, is still so influenced by those days in Oxford, and those days that we all debated and really thought hard about what nursing was doing and where it was at. And so the energy within, because the energy that I discovered about nursing, I really discovered in Oxford. I had, as June had said, I had originally trained as a mental health nurse in Ireland, had ran out of it at great speed. I hated it. But somehow my father had told me that I needed to stay in nursing because I would always have a pension. And so to really annoy him, when I left Ireland, the first thing I did was spend my pension, because I thought that was the best thing to do. And but then kind of really found where my heart was, which was really working with older people and working in more kind of community rehab type orientation with older people with dementia. And somehow that is what has always driven me and always will continue to drive me. And I've managed to come back to it as a nurse consultant again in my role that I managed to fulfill, which I'm really delighted about. But the issue for me is about how do we capture that energy that I see in the 17-year-olds that we admit into nursing education in Scotland. Those of you who don't know the Scottish system, of course we've got a 4-year honours degree and students start at 17 because it's a longer programme. And I look at these 17-year-olds, some of whom are thinking, what the hell am I doing here? And some of whom are absolutely filled with passion about what it is they're doing. And the thing that troubles me and kind of concerns me and makes me think most all the time with those students is how do we hold on to the energy that they have, and how do we build that energy into really passionate caring nurses for the whole of their career, and that by the time they enter the first 6 months post-registration that has suddenly happened, kind of got burnt out and are heading on a plateau. And this is a poem that I wrote back in 2008 when I was thinking some creatively around energy and how do we hold on to energy ourselves, because constantly it's kind of been stripped away from us and constantly it's under threat, and being resilient is such a hard thing to actually try and do. I think the energy of nursing is really under kind of a microscope in many ways today, and I think it's also very contradictory and very conflictual for many nurses in terms of how they prioritise and think about what do they focus their energies on. And I just wanted to kind of just raise some of those issues before getting into some of the other things I want to talk about. It would be very easy in this talk, given what's going on in nursing, to talk about bursaries, to talk about the review of education, to talk about what the branches are going to be, and frankly, it just bores me. It just, for me, is not what we should be focusing on. Yes, of course, people like June and Liz have to pay attention to that kind of thing, but for those of us who are... and some others. But for most of us, what we have to really think about is what kind of nurses we want. What do we really want nurses to be really doing, and how do we actually make those systems work for us rather than actually get in the way of us. And I think one view of nursing is this very caring, hands-on care delivery approach. Of course, we all sign up to hugely, and of course we see it still largely as the essence of what we're about. One of the people I've been really influenced by in the last couple of years is Carrie Martinson. If anybody has ever read her work, this is the only book in English that has been translated of hers. She's a Norwegian nurse philosopher, and I've had the privilege of spending time in Carrie's company as I like to think we're in dialogue, but mostly it's her talking at me. She has this beautiful kind of view drawn from the Danish philosopher Lokstrup in terms of looking at what it is that we are about when we're talking about care. And she talks about it as the house of care, that it's not just a singular caring experience, but it's actually about building a house, a place of safety, within which people who are inevitably vulnerable need to be held, and that's what we're about. And in a conversation with her one day, she used this phrase, and it was one of those kind of real dagger moments of, gosh, that is what this is about. That when we're really in a caring relationship, we take away something of the person that we're in that relationship with. And I guess for me, it's that part of nursing that I see under greatest threat today, is how do we hang on to a system that allows nurses to have those moments, to actually really have those deep connections that we can carry away with us and that hold us as people throughout our lives. With that, of course, is the whole agenda now of being compassionate. Of course, once the Francis inquiry is over, then everybody wants to be compassionate. And it's been fascinating to me to watch both in literature, but also in practice, just how the language of compassion has suddenly started to dominate so much of the thinking. And I was really quite, in a way, shocked by that at first, because for many years, those of us who were focused on care and caring and experience, etc., were really quite pushed to one side at the expense of targets and efficiency and effectiveness. And all of a sudden, to find myself on the same platform as this of chief executives who were talking about compassion was really quite a turnaround for me in the world of healthcare. But how real is it? I think it's something that it is good that it's been given a voice. But how do we locate it, and how do we ensure that it is happening on a continuous basis? And you may have seen some of the media, I'm not sure if it made its way down here, but our new chief nurse in Scotland has just got herself into some deep water by publicly saying that perhaps all nurses in Scotland aren't compassionate. Eureka, wow. And of course, the media have just taken it for all its worst to say, how could she possibly say this about the profession of nursing? Well, actually she could, and she's right. It's just we maybe not wanting to actually hear it. Alongside that, I think, is the whole dialogue we seem to have in nursing, which I think is an interesting one philosophically if we kind of unpick it. The problem I have with it is that it tends to focus on nostalgia, and that in nursing we confuse tradition with nostalgia big time. Tradition is good. Lots of things about our traditional perspective of nursing we still have, and we should still hang on to, and we should still own it. But I think we're doing our students no favours if we continue to speak about nostalgic times that actually, yes, they were simpler, but maybe they didn't really exist in the way that we actually remember them. And I think we need to move away from that and really, yes, hold strong to those traditions of nursing that are in our being, but actually let go of some of those things that really are nostalgic and are of another era and don't belong in the era that we're working in now. And finally, I think the other challenge that the new nurse has today is best represented from this work by Davina Allen from Cardiff, if you know her work. Davina Allen did this amazing study, which I am still quite surprised about. It doesn't get as much media focus as it should, and it's very under-recognised body of work. And it's titled The Invisible Work of Nurses. But what she actually argues is that all of those things that I've said about nursing previously, about the hands-on work, the caring, the relationships, the connections, the spending time, that actually in reality we are doing the modern nurse no favours by continuing to have that as the central focus of nursing. Because the modern nurse today is all about coordination. The modern nurse today is about holding all these complex balls in the air, trying to coordinate these complex journeys for patients who are in incredibly vulnerable situations, and trying to make that okay for them in a way that requires huge amounts of complex decision-making, not just with individual patients, but with whole systems. And I think there's a very legitimate argument within all of that, in the sense that that's what I see the kind of more senior nurses today doing. It's what I tend to do when I'm in my nurse consultant role, and the opportunity to be with an individual patient for a long period of time is less and less. But actually my effectiveness is very much about trying to help, in my case, frail older people, find the way through that system. And for me, that is consistent with Carrie Martinson's work in terms of care. And I think we have to start to not say, if you're not with patients and touching them, you're somehow failing as a nurse, but to actually really recognise we do that in a very different way today than maybe it was done back then, whenever that nostalgic period was. So that's my bit of a rant about where it is, and I have to get it out of the way just to kind of contextualise it really. But the other thing that I do want to say is we, in terms of how we help nurses to understand what it is that they're about and how they stay going forward, June rightly said that she and I and others back way then were working in a simpler world where quality and improvement and development and stuff were more easy perhaps to achieve. Not sure the evidence was always as strong as it is now, but at least some progress was made to achieve. And what we've seen since that period is really a surgence of improvement methods. If we're not doing improvements now, you're not doing anything. And all those processes that were really more relational, in my view, that were about working with people and creating cultures and contexts that enabled them to find their own way through complex systems, were really, in many ways, wiped away. And I've been fighting that case for many, many years, and Angie and I did write a paper some years ago called Alone on the Edge, because that is how it felt. If you weren't talking about improvement methods, you were definitely on your own. And I was really blown away last year when Don Berwick gave the keynote talk at the International Quality Improvement Conference, whatever it's called, in London, to thousands of improvement scientists, where he basically, if you go to that link, you can find the video. He basically said we're wasting their time, and basically said that, frankly, after all these years of millions of dollars or millions of pounds, that there was little evidence to show for it. There was little to show of really changing the lives of people as they went through the care system. And what he argued was that actually the only way that people learn is to learn through practice. Hey. And that the only thing that will make care better for people is to make it more person-centered. Well, hey again. How much money do we have to spend to realise and focus on people and learning and practice, that somehow that is the essence of creating excellence in care? But this was a big turning for me, because it does show a shift that I do see now happening in the whole world of how do we improve practice, how do we improve services, away from these kind of prescribed methods that in many ways are devoid of relations and of people. And so for me, at the heart of this is person-centeredness. It's at the heart of what I think we should be educating nurses to think about. However we define that, we could debate and talk about forever, and I'm quite happy to have that debate and discussion. But there are multiple ways of viewing this. But fundamentally, it is about how we form relationships with people that we describe as being healthful. These are relationships that help us to feel healthy within that relationship, however we define that. And that actually connects people and joins the mob. Obviously, it's a values-based approach to how we work, and it is about trying to build strong relationships. And I was delighted to meet today some of the colleagues who wrote the small handbook that's about clinical skills, in a sense, that is based on person-centered work here at Brooks, and that's fantastic to see that kind of thinking coming into that kind of work. So for me, person-centeredness is where we're at. But if we think about how do we educate staff, how do we educate the future nurse to actually really embrace that very complex philosophy, because it is a complex way of viewing care. From our research, looking at how staff feel challenged by trying to be person-centered, these are some of the things that we have found over now 16 years of research into person-centeredness and person-centered practice. The first one is that it is a really challenging ask of staff in the complex systems that they work in today. The constant tussle that they experience between prioritization, going back to what I said about where nursing is kind of contradictorily placed, and on one hand you're the coordinator of everything, but on the other hand you're being judged because you're not spending all your time with one patient, then what we see played out is that staff are living through that contradiction continuously on a day-to-day basis. And if we are expecting people to be person-centered, we have to decide what it is we really want them to be doing. Where do we want them to focus that energy? In our most recent paper that built on some of the study, and this was a study of a lot of narrative work that we did with patients and staff across a whole variety of settings, what we actually kind of concluded as a core theme was this issue about vulnerability again, which was again lining up with Corey Martinson's work. But this business that the reason we don't see the vulnerability as being people are vulnerable just because they're in hospital. Their vulnerability is because they're actually trying to navigate these systems that in their stories that they tell us, actually they have no clue about. They are, no matter how much information we think we're giving, they just can't work them out because they are just too complex. But alongside that, we now have even more complex care processes that a whole variety of staff are delivering. And the systems within which nursing is operating are frankly not that organised. I kind of mourn some of the primary nursing type thinking, and I don't see it in the practice settings that I'm working in. I just see a whole collection of different ways of trying to join things up. But at the end of it, what we have are vulnerable patients who are trying to navigate their way through all of this work. And hence, for me, again, why I think what Davina Allen is saying, we should focus on how do we navigate with people through that, is a really important person-centered function for us to play as nurses. And finally, what we did conclude, which is coming out in our latest book, is that actually very few patients experience person-centered care. Very few staff work in person-centered cultures, but what patients do have, and staff do have, are fleeting moments of person-centeredness. They have these moments when they truly feel valued, loved, cared for, respected, treated with absolute dignity, and then there are gaps where that's not happening, and then they experience them again. And of course, the issue for all of us is how do we join that up? How do we actually make this genuinely a person-centered culture where people are experiencing person-centered care and staff are experiencing person-centeredness between each other? We have been defining person-centered culture. This is actually the definition we use at my team at Queen Margaret, because we've been going a whole process of person-centered culture development in our own academic department, which is a whole other talk in itself, a very interesting one. But culture is really important to this, and we know that unless we develop a person-centered culture, we can never have person-centered care. We will only have person-centered moments, because the culture will stop it from happening. So I see our role as being very much about developing person-centered cultures that can embrace the complexity of these different ways of viewing nursing and the journeys that people are going through as they go through on them. For education, I think there's a real challenge. This is the most recent review that's come out from the Health Foundation. It was just published in November, actually. So the Health Foundation have just done a huge review of all the work that's going on globally in person-centered practice, person-centered development. And they looked at the various models, various approaches, including our work, which is interesting in itself. But one of the things they concluded was that the education models that are in place are really inadequate to educate people to be person-centered. That we aren't genuinely providing the kind of the tools of the trade that can help the new nurse or the new practitioner, because it wasn't just about nursing, to really navigate the way through this complicated system if we are going to hold the person at the centre all of the time. And fundamentally, of course, that is what person-centeredness is about. So I believe that if we are going to try and do that, if we are going to try and develop the future nurse who is able to navigate her way through the system, hold in a healthy tension these contradictions that they often feel in the way that they are pulled, then we need educators who are bloody creative, who aren't just rolling out the next set of competencies from the NMC, who aren't worried about, what is the next framework that's going to hit us, but are actually really thinking creatively about the kind of nursing, the kind of program that we want to be providing in order to produce this person of the future. And I think that is a huge responsibility for us. I don't believe it is good enough that we just say, okay, they've got a PG cert, away they go, let them in. It actually has to be really thought about the kind of person we want to shape and form and reshape the person who's going through in nursing. And to formalise that a bit, I just wanted to very quickly go through a study that we did at the University of Ulster, actually, because prior to leaving Ulster, we had introduced what was then one of the first undergraduate curricula that was completely based on a formal person-centred practice framework. But one of the things we did was to do a systematic review, a meta-synthesis of the literature to see, well, how is person-centeredness played out in the nursing education literature? I can tell you the answer now, which is it's not. But you have to go through that. You have to go through the process. Again, we defined person-centered learning because, again, we have to be clear about what that is. For us, it's the same as person-centered care, person-centered cultures, but it's in a learning context. Let's a bit over that. We used a meta-synthesis framework by Noblet and Hare, and we went through 7 stages, and we were asking this question of the nursing curricula. So we reviewed various nursing curricula, we reviewed published work relating to curriculum development to see where was person-centeredness in it. We had inclusion criteria. We had 76 papers, but then we ended up excluding quite a lot, as you do in this process, but actually it was fairly obvious to exclude them because we would get very excited when we saw a title that said person-centered learning and then go, yay, and then we go, oh, it was the title. Because that was about as far as it went. We did do quite a lot of screening, and we did the usual systematic approach, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. What I wanted to get to is that we identified 4 key themes that, in our view, were underpinning the majority of curricula that we saw, and actually a reason why they weren't as person-centred as they could be. And these are the four themes. Theme 1 was moving beyond mediocrity, and that goes back to my earlier quip, perhaps, about nurse education is more than ticking off the NMC competencies, because what we found in a lot of these curricula is that is what the curricular focus is about ensuring that we're ticking off all of the right boxes that the NMC will actually, or whatever organisation it is that's validating us, will ensure. And what we see is quite a bland curriculum. I've been quite shocked in some places what I've described as curricula being theory-free zones. What happened to the nursing theory underpinning this work anymore? What happened to any theoretical perspective underpinning this work? And that is really quite shocking for us as a profession if we are willing to produce curricula that actually don't have theory, and I don't accept that at all. The second theme we had is me, myself, and I. And this was really about how that self was represented in our nursing curricula. How do we focus on building the self of the practitioner as they become a nurse? In the curriculum at Ulster, we have focused really the whole of the first year on the self of the nurse. On that kind of psychodynamic idea that unless you focus on self and build self, then they're not resilient enough to cope with everything else that's coming at them, to recognise their own personhood. And we found an absence of that kind of thinking in the curriculum. The third one is probably well known to us all, which is how much can you pack into a curriculum and still get away with it? And how many new ideas can you pop in there? And who's got their pet module that must be hung on to it for dear life because it's mine? All of that kind of thinking that gets played out in the curriculum, rather than thinking about what is it we really must have, rather than what's all the stuff that we can pile in here. So there's little space for that kind of creativity. And the last thing was a theme that's very complex, which was learning elevators, which is not the idea of disparate curriculum or that kind of thinking, but how do we, year on year, month by month, elevate the level at which nurses are thinking and learning and progressing? How do we slowly move them up that elevator floor by floor to get to a point where they feel really full of energy to face the world of practice. And again, those kind of things were very much absent in the way that we saw curricula being put together. So the implications, I think, for us are that we've got to get hold of this kind of agenda of thinking about the kind of culture that we are educating nurses to operate in, about how we really help them to think about their ownership of their practice and be accountable for that and to be professional about that, and what are the essential things that we have to think about. We're going through that process myself at Queen Margaret's, where we're doing a radical review of what our undergraduate curriculum will look like. And I'm absolutely determined it's not going to look anything like it looks now. And we've had a year-long conversation about that, which has been quite helpful. But the focus of that conversation is about essentials. It's about not do we have to hold on to these modules, but what is it that we really essentially must be trying to do in educating our students. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but for us, we have been using the person-centered practice framework that, although it says in press, because the latest version is about to appear, we have been using that to shape curriculum, and for me it really helps, theoretically, in shaping a curriculum that can give people this kind of levels of thinking over time. The curriculum, or the framework, works on the outside in, and what we have done is kind of replace some of the kind of care and practice concepts with learning concepts, and that's been really the only change we've made to it as a framework to hold our curriculum. So at the macro level, of course, we have to pay attention to all of these strategic and political and policy positions that we need to pay attention to, and also the whole nature of the way education is changing and what it is that we're having to work with. Interestingly, when we've done mapping against this framework in terms of the kind of things that we need to be learning, actually there is no difference between the prerequisites for a person-centered nurse and prerequisites for person-centered learning. And that was a huge revelation to me. I don't know why it was a revelation, but it was, because I thought it would be different. But actually when we mapped, there is no difference. And again, it reinforces this idea that the prerequisites of the student nurse, the prerequisites of the newly graduated nurse, are the same prerequisites as the nurse who has been doing it for 40 years or whatever length of time it is. They are very much one the same thing. So we have to have them right up front in our thinking and not a kind of a future kind of idea. The care environment, or in this case it's about the learning environment, again there are tweaks that need to be made to it, but fundamentally it's requiring us to work in the same kind of way. Now this for me is the most challenging thing for us as educators, because what it means that is if we are really being genuine about having a person-centered curriculum in order to produce a person-centered nurse, then we have to ask ourselves the question, which is how person-centered is our culture of learning? How person-centered is my school of nursing? Because my experience is we're not. We actually don't engage in person-centered ways. We have ways that are often quite undermining, kind of really valuing people, that don't bring out the creativity of people. And we have a huge amount of work to do as educators, I think, to really bring out that energy that the educators have to educate these nurses of the future. And so we have a job of work to do, which is to develop our own learning environment in a way that truly is person-centered in itself. In terms of the processes, then again, interestingly, for me, the learning processes map with the care processes that workers do on a day-to-day basis. And in terms of outcome, yep, they still map onto the same process. In terms of how we evaluate them, these are the kind of standard package of tools and processes that we use in all our research. And we have, based on work we did at Ulster actually, have added into that the practice learning portfolio as a real rich body of evidence to see the progression, that escalating of person-centeredness within our students. So my point of raising this is to say there are frameworks, and if we think theoretically, then we can produce curricula that actually do hold the energy of these nurses and really build it as they go to the future. Fundamentally, what we want are students that are flourishing. What we want are all of us to be flourishing, as educators, as learners, as practitioners. For me, that is the most interesting thing, and it is the fundamental purpose of all of this, is to create people and generate people who are flourishing as human beings. And we know that some of the big scandals in nursing happen because people aren't flourishing. They're just languishing, as psychologists describe it, in a space that is just not working for them, which leads to horrible things. So flourishing is fundamentally about resilience. It's fundamentally about people who are able to engage, who know the amount of engagement, who know how to look after themselves, who are able to walk away from situations but are really able to connect with situations at the same time. And I was really struck by that 2 years ago when I moved to Queen Margaret, when I was talking to one of our graduates. So after 4 years she's educating with a first-class honours degree, she said to me, I'm really shit scared about going into practice. And there were her words. And I went, but you've been in practice for 4 years. And she said, yeah, but now I'm on my own. And it was that moment of thinking, that's not how this should be. You know, this amazing, vibrant girl was just incredible, but saying, I'm on my own. And that's not the way we really need our nurses to be feeling. That doesn't create a flourishing culture. It's not how it is going to go. And it's not the experience of everyone, I know, but I think we shouldn't have anyone feeling that way. So, to move to the final part of my talk, in creating flourishing people, we have to think differently, as I said, about what it is that we're producing and what it is that we're providing. And as I said, just ticking off the competencies isn't enough. I know you're all going to beat me up afterwards and say, of course, that's what we have to do. And yes, you're right, but it's not enough. And in the work that Angie Titchin and I have been doing around how do we help people to flourish, whether you're a student nurse, whether you're an educator, whether you're a man on the street or a woman on the street, whatever it is that you're doing, there are things that help us all to flourish as human beings, to be alive, to be connected with who we are. And I just want to walk us through those because I think they're helpful. In the slides you're going to see, there's kind of 3 sets of options for you, really. The slides all together have a verse of a poem, so each slide has a verse that makes up a whole poem that captures all of the work. There is some image that kind of, if you only want to focus on that to think about it, that's okay too. And then there are some of the kind of explanation words that I've put on there. So just for this short period, you may choose just to think poetically, you may choose to look visually, or you can just listen to my harsh Irish accent coming at you. And some of this can be found on this blog that we produced with all of these amazing resources. So the first principle, if we are going to create these flourishing people and flourishing community, is a principle that we refer to as bounding and framing. And going back to my earlier kind of analysis of nursing, this kind of care versus the coordination versus the tradition, the thing that I think is most important here is how do we educate nurses to balance strength and gentleness? Because what we are asking them to do is to be incredibly strong as people, as human beings, but at the same time, in the same moment, in the same space, with people, to be incredibly gentle, to try and hold in a very healthy tension these 2 quite complex ways of being at the same time. In order to do that, we really need to think about what's background and what's foreground for the nurses that we are educating. And I was really reminded of that last week when I was out in practice in the hospital where I work, and I was working alongside this incredible nurse who was 2 years graduated from his program, but was now an advanced nurse practitioner in training, which in itself kind of went, that's quick. And then I thought, why am I saying that's quick? Of course we could do that. And he was phenomenal. He was doing advanced assessment, he was doing incredible decision making, he was working with us in the frailty team, he was doing some phenomenal stuff. But in the process of that, we went to see one of the patients who was listed for us, who was a woman who'd been transferred from a nursing home, was incredibly frail, and had lots of stuff going on. She'd been seen by the medical consultant very early that morning, because this is an admissions unit, and had been made nil by mouth for further investigation. This was now 1:30, and she was still nil by mouth. And he very quickly, without doing any particular physical examination, said, I don't understand why she's nil by mouth. There's no reason why she should be nil by mouth. And he started to talk to her, and he said, Mary, you know, how is it for you? Was her question. And she gave a good, you know, 5 swear words to sound it all off. And then sort of said, oh son, if you could only get me a glass of cold milk, I'd love you forever. And of course that's all she wanted. She was dry. And so his mission for the rest of the next hour was to get her a glass of cold milk. And he placed in the foreground that as his focus. That's what he was going to achieve for her. And so he did some physical examination, he repeated some tests, he insisted that the consultant came back to see her, and he insisted that the nil by mouth was taken off because there was no logical reason as to why it should still be continuing. She had vowel sounds, it was all happening, but it was just being overcautious. And the consultant did agree that the nil by mouth would be taken away, and he went on a mission and got the coldest glass of milk that was possible to get. And this moment that passed between them as he just focused on helping her to have that glass of milk was really quite profound. And it really showed to me that kind of expertise, that person-centeredness in all its glory, but somebody who is able to really think about background and foreground in his practice in a way that is really quite fantastic when we see it happen in nursing, when it's really good. We also need to think about loving kindness. In Buddhist tradition, the notion of love and kindness and loving kindness is really powerful, and for me helps us to really think about caring in a very different way. Helps us think about the notion of love in our practice in a way that's often not talked about, because actually we can show that in all kinds of ways. But what it does require us to do is to think about the kind of energies, the kind of energies that we want nurses to hold on to and to really work with. And again, we have to help them to create these connections that helps them to really hold the energy that they have when they have complex situations that they're trying to work in and trying to figure out. The embracing the known and yet to be known is really something that I think that we struggle with. And I know I'm now going to say it for the 5th time, which is that it's not just about being able to tick off all the obvious and say they've achieved all their competencies, they're fit. That is the known. But the work that is the yet to be known, how do we help those nurses, like that nurse who said, I'm really scared about going into practice, to really face the work that she has yet to know as a new nurse? For me, it is fundamentally about connected relationships. The saddest thing that she said to me at that moment was, I'm going to be on my own. She's going to work in a big hospital with all of these people, but this fear of being on her own. And how are we actually ensuring that somebody like her isn't ever in that situation? And this kind of ongoing connected relationships, I think we can do from an education perspective. How do we carry on that education post-graduation to really help them to do it in a systematic way? I'm overly critical, probably, particularly in Scotland, of our CPD frameworks, which for me don't serve people well. They're not systematic enough, they don't really help people like her to really think through her future. We also have to prepare a body of nurses to live with conflicting energies. Yes, the world back then, when June and I were doing our around the world, around UK trips, was simpler, but that's never going to come back. That simplicity is never going to happen. We live in a very different world, a very different universe, where that simplicity is just not around. But I'm not convinced, and certainly based on the curricular review that we did, that our curricula are actually setting people up to look at this conflict as something that's important. Because conflict is where we really learn. Conflict is where we transform. Conflict is where we don't see crisis as being a problem. If we're thinking about it as in a critical social science perspective, then it's something that transforms ourselves. It's something that really makes us think differently. And I think we need to see conflict and challenge as that, not as something that we have to try and iron out, because we can't, but as something that we need to be managing. And I think our curricula need to reflect that. But in all of that, we also need to create stillness, spaces that people can go to be still. And of course, in healthcare, everybody's trying to be mindful now, and if you're not doing mindfulness, you're somehow not in the game. And that will, of course, disappear again into something else. But fundamentally, it's about creating spaces where we stop, we stand back, we think about what it is we're doing, we stop the rush forward, and we just hold back and be still. And it is increasingly difficult, I think, in many of our healthcare settings to create that kind of stillness. In my own team, we have been introducing more spaces within our team in our teaching day, for want of a better term, to try and have more mindfulness. And I'm sure Ilse will gloriously say how wonderful that is. But when we have team away days, we have somebody who facilitates that. And it's interesting for me, kind of just the different reactions that it has, how challenging it is for all of us to be still, to actually stop, to stand back, to just be, and to not be moving forward with something else all the time. And we need a huge amount of help to help us to actually do that. We also need to be able to embody the contrasts. That is, to be able to live them through who we are as people. And as nurses, I think this is a real skill and aptitude that we have to actually really own through our bodies what it is that we're trying to achieve. And of course, we know from all of the expert practice literature that if we embody our knowing, we really are at the essence of our expertise. But what I think we have to do is appreciate the contrasts that is happening with us. It's always going to be very, very conflictual. It's always going to be very complex, and that's not going to go away, and we really need to help students to really embrace that. We need some harmony. One of the things I think we all struggle with, particularly if you're educated into an improvement science kind of thinking, where you have a very definite start and a very definite end, is in reality there is no beginning and there is no end. It's always going to be developing, always going to be changing, always going to be different. Day by day, it's going to be a different space to be in. And what we have to do, I really feel so strongly about, is to help people within all of that myriad of conflict, is to hold on to the capacity to be human. Because there aren't bad nurses. There are just people who have got lost within the system that we have created around them. And this idea of creating spaces, of creating stillness, of help, of support, is really about holding on to our capacity for our humanness, because when that goes, then we really have lost a lot. So, what do we need to do? Well, interestingly, when I was putting this slide together, I thought, actually, when I was in Oxford, we had all that, and it was here in abundance, and it was very much about how we were. And there was a slight mourning for that, and thinking, yes, but it's not there, it's just maybe it's dormant in some ways, but still thriving and massively big in other ways. And I think we do need to really challenge the dominant model. I think we can't just carry on just accepting that the model being thrown at us, being given to us, is the one that we accept. I don't believe it is. I think we have to look at it very differently. I think we do have to look very differently at how we engage in learning. There is no doubt that all of our programs are overly taught. The suitcase model is very, very strong. But it's not so much about the content, but how does that content manifest itself? How is it allowed to live rather than to be taught? And I think that's a big challenge for us when we're looking at contact hours and all of those kind of things. I think we have to make it more facilitative and not just about more teaching, and we see lots of that happening within our various nursing programs. And really, I think, create spaces where people can really talk to each other. I'm very driven by Habermas's work around communicative space, a space where the ego is put to one side, where we have conversation that's about listening, where we focus on questions, and where we focus on some democratic solutions rather than trying to find fixes. I believe really strongly that if we focus on that as our foreground and put other things to the background, that actually we can create a very different space for learning to happen. So, thank you for listening to this rant. I think it is a time when we need vision. It's not a time to try and hang on to some nostalgia of the past that no longer exists. It's a very tricky time, I think, in nursing education, but it is a time that actually has the potential to be really energetic and create some incredible nurses of the future. And I think that's our responsibility now and into the future. Thank you.
questions for Brendan. First of all, I'd like to say thank you. It was just really great to hear about what really struck me was the use of your personal creativity, actually, to bring the tensions inherent in nursing into focus and to begin to explore how we might find, if not resolution to that, then some space at least to explore and reflect, and even if we only momentarily find a little bit of stillness, that's a point we should be trying to aim for. So, any questions for Bren? Sorry.
Or challenges.
Your diminutive there.
Oh, that's good.
Thanks very much. That was very interesting. I just wonder what you think about the relationship between building resilience in students and therefore nurses, and how that fits in with person-centeredness in that kind of, they could be seen as somewhat, you need to be tough to be a nurse, but you've also got to be caring. Where does how do we build that into our courses and educate our students to kind of be able to balance that? Where does that lie?
I suppose I would challenge the idea that somehow toughness and person-centeredness aren't in the same space, because they absolutely are. Because to be a person-centered nurse, resilience is critical, because to be a person-centered nurse, you have to break rules. You have to go with where that person is taking you. And to do that, you need a lot of strength. You need to be strong as a person. You need to be strong in yourself. And you do need to have resilience to take some of the hits that will come at you. It's in the space that I had in one of those slides about strength and gentleness. It's the balance of those two things, of in the same moment of being strong but also gentle. And if you're gentle without the strength, then actually you get weakness. And you can't continue to be person-centered. You will get a person-centered moment. But if you have strength and gentleness working together, then actually you do get something that's continuously more person-centered. Does that make sense?
Hi, thanks very much, Brendan. That was fascinating. I'm just interested in this idea of a person-centered culture and how we can actually support, not just in education, but also in practice as well, in what is effectively an industrialised health system. So I just wondered if you've got any thoughts on how we sort of solve that real conundrum.
Yeah, it's a challenge that I guess I'm challenged with all the time. I actually don't see them in a way in opposition to each other. Of course, if you get extreme industrialization, then you just get cultural deals. And any idea of humanity and person, and that's not just in healthcare, we know that from industry to be the same. So I think industrialization is always going to be here in some shape or form, because that's the kind of commodified health system we work in the world that we work in now. I think what we have to do, and I genuinely do see it happening, is create spaces where we actually can have still these kind of conversation spaces that enable us to still look at the humanity and look at how that humanity sits alongside other things. I'm involved in this probably quite heavily at the moment in work that's going on with Chief Nurse in Scotland at the minute, looking at what's started off called care assurance, but it's now called care excellence, because we have to have excellence somewhere. I'm happy with either, but the issue that, of course, it has gone into too quickly is what do we measure? So the discourse which I tried to push was one around this kind of thing, but of course within minutes the discourse went into dashboards, measurements, what are the tangible things that we measure. And if I pick Alex, the nurse I was working with last week, how do we measure that interaction that took place with that glass of milk that really had a profound change in that woman's care? Of course we can measure it if we look wider than kind of narrow dashboards and things that we can count. So for me, it's having those of us who can make those arguments within that kind of system, being able to also argue for different ways of looking at evaluation, different ways for explaining and describing and representing excellence in nursing, and ensuring that they are very much at the heart of it. Also, I think it is about how we develop our roles. So Davina Allen's work, I think, is really worth looking at in that regard, because it's not shying away from the fact that it's all about throughput, efficiency, getting people in or get out as quickly as possible. But how do we do that in a way that still respects personhood? And I think there are ways we can do that through our expertise.
Sorry, this person down here first, and then Werner.
Need a nurse.
Thanks, Brendan, for such an excellent talk. I'm a doctor with a strong interest in interprofessional education, and I'm interested to understand how you might bring some of these principles that you've espoused so eloquently within your talk to interprofessional settings, because certainly within our centre, we've just done a review of medical curricula. I see very little of the person-centeredness piece in those.
Yeah. And I'm doing some of that. And in fact, the European Society for Person-Centered Medicine, which I'm now a fellow of, actually is really pushing that agenda itself. So there's quite a strong movement happening within medicine to embrace some of the, well, not some, but this way of thinking and this way of looking at medical practice as well. There's quite a strong kickback for the same kind of reasons as I was talking about, which is the medical curricula and what has to be in there and what is priority. We do see, certainly across Europe, there are some, and you probably are aware of them, there are medical schools that are really shifting the emphasis, to humanity first and then the science, and trying to get that more in balance. In terms of interdisciplinarity, actually, there is huge scope within interdisciplinary education for this. And in fact, if I had my ideal way, I would say this should be sitting within an interdisciplinary model rather than nursing or medical or an AHP type model. I think we get too caught up in some of the professionalisation arguments that keeps these separate. I'm doing a lot of work with a particular care group at the moment that doesn't involve interdisciplinary work, and the medics are just as comfortable in this world as we have the conversation as the nurses and others are in it. I think we have to embrace it. I don't see that there's major blocks if we have the energy to really get in there and start to operate it out from inside. And there are some really strong people, I think, in that movement who are trying to make it happen. Love another conversation.
Werner, just on the end there. Yeah.
So within the current complexities of the system and the challenges of having continuous relationships, in caring relationships, do you see that relational care, which is really central to person-centered care, should be these fleeting snapshots? And if it is that we are aspiring to saying relational care can be delivered in snapshots, should we then be developing exercises where we're teaching people how to provide relational care in a very short period of time?
It's a great question. I'm not saying that we can't ever have extended relationships, but there are a lot of our settings, a vast majority of our acute settings, for example, that is really quite impossible at the moment, and I'm sure most of you who work in those settings would probably agree. So if I say nostalgic, I would say, oh, please bring back primary nursing that we used to have in Oxford. That's never going to happen. But if we think about, well, how can we make it happen, then I think what we have to do is really see the kind of the patterns, and I'm really interested in the patterns of practice rather than the kind of some of the mechanisms that's in it. The patterns that nurses engage in on any one shift, in the way that they make decisions, what they prioritise, what the background and foreground. And then how can we capitalise on those patterns? Because those patterns aren't by chance. They're actually patterns that people are using prioritisation, they're using coping, they're using quite clear decision-making to decide on how they're going to pattern their care day. And I think then we do absolutely need to be equipping nurses to think about how you maximise that relational opportunity in that moment that they have to make that work for all it's worth. One of my colleagues also is doing a PhD looking at person-centered care in an emergency setting, because of course if we're going to try that out, then one of the hardest places to try it out is an emergency setting, because often you have got 30 seconds to 5 minutes to make that impact. And she is trying some intervention work to try and do that. And I think we need to take that kind of thinking into the more kind of ward-based settings as well to help people do it. Because I think we're doing them a disservice by educating to say, you know, you're going to have all this time to build a relationship with your patients, you're going to be able to do all these washes, then you do their drugs, and then you spend more time with them, and then you help them to eat, and then we do... No, you're not, actually. You've got 5 years. And you have to really make the most of that time. And I'm not saying we shouldn't ever be trying to get the most out of the time we have, but when we have these short periods, we have to really make them work.
And I have a concern around our newer nurses having the courage and the skills to make decisions, make good decisions in a brief period of time. And I think that actually getting to a point of educating them to do that is really at the nub of it.
Yeah, and it's really interesting you raise that, because where I'm doing my practice, the director of nursing there has capitalised on me doing that. So she insists that I have an hour-long meeting with her at the end of my shift, which, value for money, so that's okay. We had that conversation last Wednesday because some of the things that I'm seeing in the unit, which is great overall, a bit chaotic, I've called it organised chaos largely, but stuff goes on in a very good way, really. But one of the things that she is concerned about is exactly that issue, that she sees more and more nurses coming out of all of our programs who are not less competent but less confident about the decisions that they're making. And I think that's the issue for us. It's not about competence, actually. I think it is about the confidence that they have. And how do we, in those practice settings, continue to instill that confidence and hold that energy that's needed for it. So I think there's an important point in that.
We probably have time for just one more question, I think. So, Liz?
Thank you, Brendan. Thought-provoking as ever. Just to say, at Bournemouth University, where I am, we have a parallel philosophy of humanisation, which we've implemented across all the undergraduate health programmes. But students don't always see that the relationship between the staff and the students is particularly humanised. And then that feeds back to the relationship between the staff and whether they're humanised with each other. So I was curious to hear, well, I am curious to hear what you've done at Queen Margaret's to person-centre the staff within the university.
Yep. Ilse,
see if we can learn some lessons.
Ilse SP is here as an external examiner here as one of my team at Queen Margaret, so you might want to give your perspective on that. We had a whole, most of a day yesterday doing our next day. Well, I guess it started because when I moved to Queen Margaret, there was a kind of an unwritten thing that, okay, here comes person-centeredness. But and the reality is that there's a lot about what was going on there in the curriculum, very person-centered anyway. But I do hold a very strong view that if we are going to espouse an education philosophy for students, we have to live that education philosophy ourselves. I don't shift from that very much, and if it's not possible to have a living education philosophy within a team, then I will not promote an education philosophy in teaching, because I think it's wrong, it's immoral, and I could bore you to death about the immorality of that. But so what we've been doing is really over the last nearly 2 years now is kind of on a kind of a one of that term, the transformation program, to kind of really embrace principles of person-centeredness within our own being as colleagues and as a team. So that has meant me as head reducing some of that hierarchy, so that it's not about me as head and the rest, but actually it's generally about a shared approach to how we work. That is very, very embedded now actually, but still a work in progress. It is about having very clear values that we spent a long time working on together, probably the best part of a year maybe, trying to develop and make them real, and using those values in our various forums that we have in meetings all the time to challenge each other and question each other and ask questions of each other. We've created 3 spaces. As I said earlier, I'm very drawn by the whole communicative space idea of Habermas. So we have a weekly forum, so every Wednesday at 12:15 the world stops for nursing mostly, and we have the space that can be given a topic by any member of the team to focus on. It's formal and informal, And we work with that, or it can just be a space that people want to use to talk. We have 3 to 4 away days together a year, where we go away and spend the day doing this kind of stuff. And I say doing this kind of stuff because that's how my colleagues describe it. and actually, in the last 6 months, that has really started to turn a major corner. And then the third part is we still have to have, as a team, our kind of agendaed meeting. So we have a 3-hour meeting once every 6 weeks. So the first hour-ish is the agenda parts that we get through as quickly as we can. And then the second half, the hour and a half, is a formal communicative space. It's a space for anyone to pose a question that they want an answer to or want to be worked with. And that question can be about relationships, mostly is. It can be about something that somebody is doing that is causing disturbance in the relationship. And I mostly try and hold that space and engage in something that doesn't necessarily seek resolution, but that actually seeks understanding. And they're the processes we've been using. We've been using Otto Scharmer's Theory U as the kind of framework to guide our journey and to monitor where we're at on it, really. And there's been various tricky moments in it and various ups and downs, but actually I really have felt it started to turn a corner the last, well, probably just before Christmas and on to now. It's, it's starting to feel person-centered.
Okay. Thank you. And you know what is really nice is to be reminded that there are, that sometimes our curricula become very instrumental. And particularly, more recently, I think, they have become quite instrumental in responding to life out there in the service. And it's really great to have actually a very forceful reminder that instrumentalism is not what makes good nurses.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jean.